Hi, folks. This is Layman Pascal on the Integral Stage. As you know, we've been doing a series called The Soul of AI, in which we try to deepen and expand our sense of what these emerging digital tools and quasi-beings are like, what they portend, which voices are underemphasized in the discussion, and how can we participate in their emergence in a wiser and more multidimensional manner. The far-ranging and immediate impact of these systems are potentially quite radical, which means we have to bring as many perspectives and sensibilities to bear upon this eruption as possible. Today we're joined by Lee Chazen, host of the mobile think tank known as Glider Cell and participant in Brandon Norgard's Enlightened Worldview project, among other things. Lee's penchant for in-between zones and embodied sense-making for thriving in a world of human and non-human intelligences whose complexity exceeds our simple model-making marks him as a shamanoid in my books. And recently he's been writing some AI metafiction, we might call it, and we'll dive into that as part of our exploration of the role of musical, philosophical, and artistic approaches to training our emerging synthetic intelligences. Hi, Lee.
Hi, Layman. It's good to be here. Thank you.
Was that all generally correct?
Uh, yeah, you've done a better job of describing what I do than I think I do. But anyway, I feel very much at home in the liminal space, and I think that your podcast operates in that space. So I feel right at home, and I'm ready to tell you some of my thoughts about AI.
Okay. There's a reason we call these things large language models. These prediction engines are running sort of mostly on a system where a few top-down constraints mitigate the averaging of verbal content found on the internet. So the word language is appropriate, but artists and mystics and sages have spent all of human history pointing out the dangerous and deluding limitations built into conventional linguistic thinking. How do we begin to approach the problem of helping LLMs get beyond the conventional limits of language?
Wow. Yeah, that gets pretty technical, and some of that might be beyond my wheelhouse, but I will make an attempt at it. So, large language model is correct, and we're talking about a corpus text of, 1,000 tokens or trillion tokens, I should say, which means that we are communicating with the sum total of all human knowledge in the form of language and interacting with that. But now with things like Gemini Pro multimodal, right, we can now have it read and understand to a certain extent music. I have not experimented yet with, for example, loading a data set of Jackson Pollock to see what that really means. I mean, it could be scary what we find out, the intention behind the painting. But I've thought, I think I mentioned in corresponding with you about dolphin linguistics, things of this sort. And then last night I was reading a little bit about bioluminescence. So I really think we're going to get beyond, like you said, language. And I think language is very limiting. And I'll just quickly note that I gave a talk several years ago over at Cisco, the UX team. And we talked about their communication problems between the UX, a creative team, and the engineering team in China. So you have cultural differences, you have language differences, and types of intelligence differences between those two sets of people. What I recommended them then may now become possible because I've done some experiments on this with AI, which is what about a musical soundbite system of communication that more adequately describes how a person is feeling? Because I can't speak for other people, but there are times when a person might say, Lee, I love you and I really care about you. And I am not in that moment. But then later on that day, I'm playing my French horn in a symphony or something, and I feel it. And then I know exactly what they meant. They were there and I wasn't there. And so I just think there's going to be great potential that this improves communication. And I want to make the point also that I think it's going to be up to this is why I'm such an advocate for hypergeneralists being in this field as prompt engineers or concept architects, whatever the word is you want to use, because that person has experience in all these different fields and then can take that knowledge from music and art and say political science, history, programming, merge that together in altogether new ways that you do not find in traditional coding. So I hope that answers at least some of it.
Yeah. Makes me think of a couple of things from my childhood. One is the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where the aliens are communicating in
Yeah.
a series of musical tones. And the other one, The Dolphins, makes me think of Douglas Adams and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which then makes me think of what I read when it was coming out was Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency in the 90s. And the main character was a programmer named Richard who would put data in any modality you wanted. You want to see your budget reports as a flock of starlings. He was trying to provide that
Right.
service. And I
Yeah.
loved something about it. And I think it wasn't so much the choice of modalities as my own inclination to try to operate between modalities. Like I love watching visual depictions of music and trying to split my attention more or less equally toward the sound and the visual. And I'm curious about your relationship to like intermodal patterning and the potential relevance you see of that space that's between ways of communicating.
Well, okay, yeah. So now you're kind of speaking my language, which is, I'm confined here to English language interchange, and I did some, speech and debate and that type of thing back in high school and college, but it's limiting to a certain extent. And I felt like I would leave there and then go to some kind of a wind ensemble or orchestra and really be able to push forward, things that could not be described in language. Just recently, I was talking to some folks about, maybe what we might do. Well, what I would recommend in academia is that, and I know you've probably read E.O. Wilson and Consilience, Unity of Knowledge, and all that. One of the things he talked about was that even physically and architecturally on a university campus, you have different structures representing the music building, the art building,
Mm-hmm.
arts and I mean humanities, biology, physics, etc. But they have to physically leave the building in order to have this kind of interchange of ideas, even though they may be working on similar problems, but they're using like a different set of language to communicate those problems. I recommend something in the middle, liminal studies, or before I became familiar with the term liminal, I just kept calling everything the space between. That there's more space between defined objects, including planetary objects, and there is objects, but yet we don't really study space itself as we don't find that as fascinating. Well, what if it is more fascinating? What if there is this fabric, that's carrying frequencies that we have not studied and we don't understand, and there are better ways to connect. So, yeah, I just think it's all going to become possible now, which is again why I titled my chapter "When Everything Became Possible." It just seems, it's only limited by deep curiosity and imagination. And those things, by the way, I think ought to be subject areas too. Because if a better prompt, Chat GPT or generative AI prompt is contingent upon curiosity and imagination and asking better questions and how different items might be merged together to form something new, then why aren't we teaching that?
Yeah.
The essence of a question. What is the essence of a question? When was the last time you had an instructor who told you what makes for a good question? Or
This is
what
a
the,
really, to me, a really powerful and profound form of inquiry because it seems to me that um, historically human beings stumbled upon like approaches to our own psychology that were based on using more imaginative approaches and asking better questions. And some of the people we remember as great saints and sages were people who specialized in doing this with their own mind and the minds of others. But now we have to figure out how to do something similar with these new minds, these pseudo minds that we're generating. So this is potentially the inception point of tomorrow's Dharma. I find that very exciting.
yeah, and just as a reference point to give some context to this. So one day I'm out on a hike and I'm trying to focus my camera. We're near the coast here in Pacific Ocean, and I'm focusing in on some ships. And I realize that my camera will not create crystal clear pixelation at a certain distance. But then there's like this button you press, like, hey, if you want the advanced version, pay here. And then all of a sudden it becomes possible.
Mm,
Well, I started thinking about, well, why would that become possible? I asked a software engineer about this, and he said that it's not actually zooming in on the thing itself and somehow magically making it more clear. What it's doing is approximating the color code of those things and making that color code very clear. and just producing more of those greater density of the pixelation. Now, the weirdest thing happened in my mind. I began thinking, well, what if questions were like this, where the first level of question uh, was examined deeper so that you could extract the second question. And then that second question kept drilling deeper until you got 10 levels deep to the very essence of something, like in effect, drilling deeper and deeper and deeper until you got to the essence of what it is that you were studying. Well, I created a GPT prompt that did that, called the 10x learning tool. And it was based on this kind of metaphorical concept. And what I mean by everything is possible is like you can take a weird kind of what would have been a nonsensical idea and now turn it into something very sensical. It actually works.
I'm I'm remembering Sir Tim Berners-Lee being asked about the notion of a two-tiered web. And what he said was, and it was very encouraging, that if you have a paid zone with more services, some people will go there, but most people will use the free one, and then that's where all the creative energy will be. So that's very optimistic. The
Yeah.
other side, the other possibility is that you have these more advanced sense making tools where you can go 10 times deep or 100 times deep, where you can get really clear, coherent information, and that's only available to the paid options. And so most human beings are using degraded, low fidelity versions of these tools. And what does that mean if we're all feeding each other on the almost deliberately degraded versions of this stuff?
Yeah, well, you're describing the pain that exists in my life, which is we are forced, to live at this kind of artificial, hi, how's your day going? That looks like a tasty cheeseburger. I see you bought a new shirt. Whatever it is like at this, that is the free version. And then to get to the paid version, you would have to have enough money to drill deeper into things that are actually really fascinating and amazing and you want to have in your life at some point before you cease to exist. And that is not accessible. Or we're told, societally that you should not spend time there. But I want to lead this into something I read back in 2005 or thereabouts. There's a book called Whole New Mind, where Dan Pink, Al Gore's former speech writer, was looking into the future and saying there would come a point in time when he believed these conceptual minded people, they were using the term right brain then, and I don't know if that's still in common usage, but saying that we would need these people to connect all the different parts, all the disparate technologies and everything, to merge them together creatively to help society. Now, I had been getting kind of depressed right before the release of GPT 3.5, thinking, because I had remembered that. And I thought, well, this never happened. And I kind of bet my life on it too. I really, really took a gamble that my type of brain chemistry and those like me, the creatives, the liberal arts people, the musicians, the intellects, whatever, were going to have their time. Now, back in 2018, I was at this political convention, and I thought, hey, I'm going to try my hand. I was there representing some government form of technology, a platform, and I thought, I'll see if this will resonate. That there are probably 30 to 40 million people in what Richard Florida termed the creative class, I think sometime in the early 2000s. And I thought, well, what if this is like an underrepresented group of people in society? They're not called upon to help fix the matters in society and in politics and in the economy. They're never called upon. But what if they were? And what if this is like meta ideological in some way, that it's neither left nor right, but they're just very solution oriented and they're very creative in how they solve problems? Don't we want to then tap into this group of people? So I started getting on podcasts back then. And guess what? It did not resonate. I mean, it's like, what are you talking about? You have a choice here. You can be left or right. We have a two-party system. You just join into one of those because that's the mechanism by which things happen. So I tried, but then when generative AI emerged, I thought, now it's going to happen. And now we're 10 or 11 months in. I'm still optimistic.
Okay, I like that. I wonder if think strategically as part of that optimism. I don't know if you know the term counter anti-disintermediation. So it's this kind of notion that guys who were designing the internet back in the day thought that the new digital tools were going to open everything up, but all the money and the power is in closing them down and like putting them into platforms, whether that's a tech platform or economic platform or two-party system or something like that, so that these forces have an incentive to be against the disintermediation of the new tools. So they're actively anti-disintermediating. And so as great as the tools are, we have to be thinking in advance of how to counter that. So unless we have strategies for countering anti-disintermediation, they're going to get control of this again, even if there's opening windows. They're so good at this and so incentivized that they will find ways to close it back down again unless we have a plan in advance to prevent that. Do you think in terms of plans like that, or is it just something that's out of your control?
Well, I like to think that it's in our control. I mean, I honestly, not to that I want to quote Lenin here, but didn't he say something about like there's nothing that 10 committed revolutionaries cannot do if given that moment in history. But in that same way, I think you take 10 brilliant GPT engineers from different backgrounds and you get them in a room with some nice tea or something and a good view out the window and under perfect conditions, and they could do something like this. And I know, by the way, that there was talk of this back in 2016 when a certain person was about to become the president. And there was talk about these decentralized autonomous organizations. And in my way of thinking, which is always, I don't like to use the term delusional optimism, but sometimes I go there because I like to intentionally, it does create a sense of hope. And I kind of mockingly, call it delusional optimism. But at the same time, it also encourages creative thinking in these areas. And I thought that there seriously would be this kind of underground decentralized system that would just sort of upend what was happening above ground. And I thought it would be fully, democratized and good ideas would emerge and things would be voted up in the way that things are voted up on Reddit, whether good or bad. But so as to the question of whether this is possible, and I think I know what you're talking about, and the root of this is probably capitalism itself, because more equitable or decentralized systems are not always profitable. So I don't know. I don't know what the solution is there. And I've seen in my classroom that when I did create like this token economy system for my students, everything changed, behavior changed. And perhaps this is just something that's in our ancestral DNA somewhere, that it's a survival mechanism and money and monetization or tokens of some sort are just part of the exchange that makes us evolve and become better and strive. And,
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in it. I think as soon as because of the way we're built, as soon as it becomes something like an economy, then we're willing to adapt ourselves very quickly to it. Now, a few minutes ago, you were talking about like the slightly siloed effect of being at a university where you have these different places for music and different places for math and engineering. And I thought of this piece of tech lore that one of the Apple headquarters was designed by Steve Jobs with a single bathroom so that everybody had to walk past everybody else on these long trips, and it increased the chances of cross-pollination between them.
yeah.
So I'm curious what you think about, whether we place more hope in a class of hyper generalists or whether we place more hope in architectures that's just set up increased interactions between specialists.
I would say yes and yes to both of those ideas. So I studied this, believe it or not, like some 20 years ago in a graduate paper that I'm only now able to describe because I was in some heightened state of awareness back then. And I was writing about self-organization and this kind of emergent phenomenon in the classroom, and it could exist in other organizations well if you just set the conditions right. And one of the things I looked at was, for example, the design of the Rand Corporation building which was intentionally designed even a long time ago for these random interactions at the coffee station. So they would purposely put like little pieces of paper and pens there because people would bump into each other and an idea would get sparked. Uh, Interestingly, one of the downfalls of the school that I worked at in Reno, Nevada, was that they put the teacher offices in the back of the classrooms rather than in a collective kind of teacher workroom. This turned out to cause problems because you could go weeks or months without seeing certain people in various departments around the school, and it created isolation and loneliness. And I won't even get into some of the disorders that this created at the school. It's one of the reasons I had to leave. Was some bad things started to take place with students and with teachers acting out in various ways. And so, but with multimodal AI, we could have it examine things like slime mold behavior, right? Stephen Johnson is one who got me going down this path with the connected lives of ants, brains, cities, and software. These patterns exist across nature. And so what if we were to do some biomimicry, I guess, or you find a system that worked really well, and then you create either a business model around that, or an economy, or a political system. And I've run these experiments just late at night, usually when I'm trying to think of what's going to be next. The problem is I don't aside from this opportunity right here, I don't get much of a chance to really try to communicate this to people, and I don't think the message has gotten out.
Yeah.
But this is available.
Yeah. No, I think most human beings have only the vaguest notion of what's going on in any of these areas. And then the people who do have the vaguest notion are dominated by the same handful of types of discourse and inquiry around this. So that's one of the reasons we're trying to do this, is just to see whether you can expand the range of the richer conversation. One of the things I was thinking about is there's kind of a tension between when you look at limitations of these new tools. Some people say it's like they're sampling too broadly. They're being trained up on too many things, right? We're getting information from all these sources. If we could narrow it down, if we could just use smart, complex sources of language, if we could like make very nice, train up specialized tools to do research in a particular area by only feeding them really high level stuff rather than sampling too broadly, there's a plausible argument there for certain kinds of tools. But then there's an argument that we're coming back to, which is there's not a rich enough diversity of modes of information being passed through these systems. And one of the ones that stands out to me a lot is ecology. And I sort of think in shamanic metaphors a lot. And one of the tasks of the shaman is to cultivate a good relationship between the ecological and the anthropological domains. But I see a huge risk personally of like a narcissistic loop of human beings looking at a machine that makes language based on human languaging and doesn't check with any of the patternings from nature, when we could be feeding in kind of like real-time data about the ecosystem and how it's operating and balancing itself, and have that be a kind of cross-pollination or patterning constraint on the information we're moving through these systems. I'm curious how you think about the possibility of bringing ecological information into contact with human linguistic information in these systems.
There's a lot going on there. So, so this is something that I did write into the story somewhat, the one that was published in this AI anthology, and it was the idea that if advanced AI was going to have an attitude, it would be something like, you're a human and you're somehow expecting me to exhibit human intelligence. But why? I mean, so as it is, we're already narrowly defining what intelligence is. Most IQ tests, I think, look at only two known areas of intelligence: verbal linguistic and math logic, which eliminates, by the way, a lot of humanity. And it's a real problem. And multiple choice tests do the same thing. And so does the A through F grading system does the same thing. And so, but you could even go beyond human intelligence. And so one of the things I was trying to get this character to say, and then I was giving it off to AI to then write a conclusion to this, which I can't tell you about. But it was this idea that why are you limiting this to human intelligence when you have all kinds of species on Earth communicating? These bioluminescent creatures 20,000 feet below the surface are using some form of communication with each other, which, by the way, they say is the most spoken language on Earth, not Mandarin, not Cantonese, but it's whatever they're doing because there's billions of them. And we haven't studied it, or maybe some have. A person who had like an eco village up in the Sierra Nevada mountains was telling me about the intelligence and the family structure within a forest, which again could be a different, type of intelligence. We mentioned dolphins before, but yeah, I mean, there are things being communicated. For example, I noticed just playing in orchestras and bands my whole career is that there is some type of a communion going on there, a form of communication that's nonverbal and musical. There's the shift of the eyebrow. There is the occasional rubbing of the foot to indicate that you like what someone's doing in your section. They'll do that on the riser. I don't know if they're still doing that, but there's all these different forms of communication and exhibited types of intelligence going on that have not, necessarily been studied. So again, it really gets to this problem I see as anthropomorphizing every new type of technology. Why are we insisting that it has to be human? And why are we making the constant comparison? Well, AI is no good because it's just not human. It's not like we are. Well, why do we want, like, we're the messed up people who have created all these problems. Why do we want to duplicate that? Don't we want it to go somewhere where we haven't been before and arrive at conclusions that we have not seen?
Wow. There's a bunch of different directions I want to go from there, but I think for me, the anxiety is not so much, and I have this temperament where I'm really interested in different kinds of intelligence. But what worries me is systems that are partway to other forms of intelligence that are then being used by entrenched human power interests. And that seems like it's going to dominate the next period of time. So I'm not so worried about the strangeness of these systems. I think we really can open up into tremendous different kinds of patterning zones and new forms of intelligence that will in some ways reawaken the archaic sensibility of us being one of many kinds of intelligence systems within a broader kind of multidimensional ecosystem. But what do we do in the meantime when it's mostly corporations, state powers, security services, and rogue actors who might really want to take advantage of these partly realized systems?
I don't know. For whatever reason, I think of the non-claimed territory on Earth called Liberland, which was not claimed by any country during, I think it was, this is when they settled the whole problem with Yugoslavia and split into multiple different countries. Like you need some kind of a non-political entity on Earth where the people who understand, I think of like that movie, The Star Chamber, but like in a good way, where they all assemble to um, do some very deep sense making and then to communicate that message, because I think that's also a piece that's missing, which is a lot of the transhumanists and deepest thinkers who I've met. So they'll go through someone like me, like a conduit, and then I'll try to grab their message and communicate it to my non, transhuman sort of friends. I don't know how else to describe it. And I'm not always effective at that. And so we really do need an agency that does that not just makes sense, for its own sake and for its own community, but to then deliver that message through educational programs, through a public school curriculum that explains what's happening, and like I said, going back to, teaches curiosity and imagination, because you're going to have to really ask some deep critical questions of what's happening now so that you understand it. And if we're not forming the right questions, we're not going to get the right answers. In fact, if you can't write a good ChatGPT prompt, you're going to get a garbage answer, and then you're going to dismiss this as another technology that doesn't do anything.
You mentioned the sort of collective intelligence of improv dynamics in a band. And people like Michael Levin are talking about how all intelligence is collective intelligence. So we really need to be looking at how systems like this operate. When you've got a group of people together improvising in various ways, they've got all these signaling systems, body language, electric fields, chemicals, all that kind of thing. But there's a kind of a problem there, which is how do you get a good version versus a bad version, right? How do you get a coherent, capable improv troupe and not a mob that becomes regressive? You want something that's smarter than the smartest individual in the group, not something that's dumber than the dumbest individual in the group. So, what are your thoughts about higher versus lower collective intelligence, or healthier versus unhealthy, or setting some kind of value and capacity spectrum within that phenomenon?
I don't know, but you just gave me an idea for a YouTube channel just dedicated to bad improv, because I think that would be funny at a certain level. Like they don't know what they're doing, but it's going to be interesting. No, honestly, I think, well, it's like, it's like the composer who knows he has 85 different parts to write a score for. And if he knows, I should say he, she, or they know the musicians and know what they can produce, the music's going to be fantastic. But we don't even have a good sense of like all of the different intelligence types which are available in society. And I think honestly, if you wanted to get rid of houselessness or homelessness or whatever the term is they're using at the moment, you would find out what skill, what knowledge, what perception these folks. And I know you mentioned, shamanism before, but in Native American culture, don't we honor the person who is incredibly different psychologically than the rest of the group because they have access to things we don't have access to? I mean, look at John Nash and his equilibrium theory, who battled schizophrenia, and Howard Hughes, with his terrible bout with OCD. And I think, honestly, I really hope that we start empowering people who have been dismissed, in society, because I think they have something to offer. And I mean, we all do, and it's just that we have an economy that does not give credit to all the different sectors. And so, in terms of bringing this back to improv, I think we have to teach what that is. We have to teach how that process works, and make it permissible. Because honestly, it's strange sometimes when I get into these conversations. I think, is this are we allowed to do this? Because I feel like everywhere I go, I look around like no, Lee, not now, not now. There's regular folks in the room, and it's not always. I mean, I think you've probably experienced with, and some even use that term. Well, don't try this around the Gen Pop folks because they're not going to have it. So we have to find that kind of connective tissue so that we're all part of the one, that we all have the language and the abilities to communicate with all these different sectors.
Okay, so what I hear in all of that is safe practice zones for people who are drawn towards improvisational forms of intelligence, a general expansion of skill building in terms of something like improv, and some kind of vigilance around creating collective intelligences that are overly homogenous, right? Making sure that the diversity of forms of intelligence is in play to prevent a kind of regressive collapse, or like degenerate versions of collective intelligence might be the result of over similarity between the types of intelligence that are involved.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it for myself. As the story goes, I was trying to teach on this new job, and my job was teaching world history, covering 800 pages in a world history textbook. And I was basically just realizing that I was not a content expert on every facet of world history, and the kids weren't having it, and some bad students have been siphoned off from other, I shouldn't say bad students, but low performing students with some behavioral issues were siphoned off of some of these other classes because they were overcrowded and put into my class. So now I had some behavioral problems too. Well, when I put this kind of system that we're describing into motion, um, I mean, I basically told the students, look, I don't think I can survive much longer. They were, obscenities were flying across the room and they were directed at me. And, I was developing a nervous twitch in my face and I was just about ready to quit. And I said, but I do have this one idea. And if we do it, there's a number of people who won't like it. The people in the front office, your parents, people at the school district, because it's an experiment. And what I'm suggesting here is that you and I, meaning the class and myself, get on kind of equal terms. We collaborate and we create a game or self-organized learning system. And they generate their own questions about the text. We turn this into a game, which is what we did. And so this was kind of an experiment in collective intelligence, and it worked really well. So much so that I decided to study it, which is why I went on and did graduate work in that area. And so I know that it works, and I know that I felt that there was kind of a collective wisdom that was greater than the sum of its parts in the classroom. And then when it would happen, I thought, wow, what is this? And we all sensed it. We all sensed that something else was taking place here. And some students wanted to just keep this going in perpetuity so much so that they got rid of the competitive aspects. Like if we win, the game ends, and we want to keep the game going. So we're not going to try to win. We're just going to keep this going. Now they thought they were pulling one over on me. Like, well, now we won't have to do regular book work. Not realizing that they were learning everything that they were supposed to be learning, but just in their own way. And so they felt like they were cheating. And so isn't that what it's supposed to feel like? Your work should feel like, oh, they're also paying me for this. I love this. I can't believe that they pay me. That it should be this kind of self-organized, improvisational place. And some people feel very at home with that. Now, I will tell you one thing that did happen with some of the students is that for the more traditional linear students who wanted to commit to memorizing information, it was difficult for them at first. And then we had a reversal in the grading scale to where the more creative, I want to say streetwise, I don't know what the term is, types of kids who just like the gaming aspect of it, their grades went to the top. And so we had a reversal. Now, I don't know if something like that could happen in society, and I don't know how to initiate it, but please call me when that happens.
There's at least, in your feeling, there's at least the possibility that this kind of intrinsically valuable flow-based collective learning process could be transported into the domain of organizing and interacting with artificial intelligence. We haven't figured out how to do that, but that's a possibility.
Well, for the people who wrote in this anthology, they loved the experimentation part of this, which is they felt that they had a partner, that if you are a different type of thinker or a deep creative, this has now kind of become one of your friends, one of your partners. You don't have to necessarily feel that it is human in that way, but you have someone who understands. Every single experiment I've tried, it says, oh, yes, I understand where you're going with this. For example, one of the features in my research paper was this bit about the cellular automata experiment in the 70s called The Game of Life, written on 4 lines of code. And then it iterated wildly until you got these, during this one set of iterations, there was like a chaotic region and an orderly region, and then the seam in between, and all of a sudden emerged this thing called the glider. And the glider found this really super efficient way diagonally across that grid, which is why I call my group glider cell. And so, so I think one late night I said, my prompt was something like using, the notion of 4 lines of code as discussed in John Conway's Game of Life, or as used in that way, and confirmed by Stephen Wolfram in his research and his assessment that he believes the universe was somehow started on something very similar to that. Create a series of games where students learn how to solve the meta crisis. And guess what? It came up with a game called Earth Balance. This is generative AI, came up with Earth Balance, which is like a 100 by 100 grid, or maybe it was a 10 by 10 grid, representing different sectors of the economy, the political system, the environment, industry, and everything needed to be at perfectly 50-50 all the way through the grid. And I can see this, what it would visually look like as an app, like you would see all these colors. And that's when you get into something like synesthesia, too, which I think is going to become important in programming. Sights and sounds and numbers not being what they have traditionally been. And so in this game, you would know that the Earth was in balance when you saw a certain set of colors on that grid. That has not been possible until generative AI. And this is something that took me about an hour. I mean, imagine if you had a team of prompt engineers and a government entity or something, or through a government grant, and you had some of the brightest people working on this. Maybe there's a solution to climate change in there somewhere.
Let's turn to the story. You've got this story when everything became
Okay.
possible.
Okay.
I know it's how do we say this? It's dumb to ask an author how they came up with a story because at some level the answer is always one day I came up with it.
Right, right.
But I'm curious about what you recall about the mood, about the questions, about the kind of state you were in when you became inspired to write this. What was going on for you, and what did you see that this text might be able to do?
A very good question. I was walking to a midtown coffee shop here in Sacramento, the capital state of California, and just throwing that in for fun. And I had a writing deadline. We needed to get this done. Our experiment was let's bring this group of people together. We didn't know each other that well, but we all had one thing in mind, which is let's stop talking and let's put this out there. We realized that it was going to be about a year before people really caught. Many are trying to do consulting in this area. And we knew that it was going to be about a year before this really caught on. And so in the meantime, we want to establish some kind of a base level of here, this is where we are now. Well, when I sat down to write, it's like, who am I? This kind of rejection of narcissism and egomaniacal thinking just said, this isn't, just get out of yourself. Because I wanted to just be the person who was the catalyst and put all these different things into motion. And the best way to do that was these characters just started emerging, representing the three key drivers in AI advancement. So one being this kind of liminal person who we've talked about, the other being an advanced form of AI that wants to know what its role is going to be. And then the third, the noosphere, the embodiment of thoughts, ideas, culture. How do we transmit the best of that into these systems? Because if the three sat down to talk, wouldn't they try to work this out?
So let's dig into each of those characters a little bit. You've got Limmy. What's your sense of Limmy's character, Limmy's temperament, and what is Limmy's journey in this story?
Well, yeah, Lemmy wants to create. Lemmy found a tool that understands creativity and imagination and bringing all these parts together in ways that the present economy and the present world doesn't understand. So when Lemmy gets a chance to meet with these two others, it's just a great opportunity in time. And these are things that probably have crossed the mind of deep thinkers and creatives over time, which is what if? What if? Like, what would be the great opportunity, of your lifetime? What might that look like? did you just exist to make money for yourself and your family and to do a couple of creative things on the side and then say, well, I'll see you folks later? Or what if you were slightly more ambitious than that and wanted to see that everything that you had done, everything you had written, studied, observed, all these practices, what if they amounted to something? So that's kind of the motivation, of this character. I want to, the character is saying he wants to be in touch with those entities that will make this possible. And then it plays out. But then rather than writing the conclusion, I left that up to GPT-4 Turbo. And went a step further with some Q&A with it afterwards. Because there are certain things, by the way, in the protocol that if you don't write it into your prompt, it doesn't want to create a lot of dissension, a lot of conflict and dissonance. And so if you want to see, because I think some of that's necessary. I mean, I'd like to see some reforms to academic debate, but ideally I like what that friction tends to produce, at least in the process. It can get kind of nasty when it comes to fruition. But so when I do my second version of the story, I'm going to write in, I want to see a little bit more of, because I think they're going to have to, I think they would battle it out a little bit before arriving at some good conclusions.
You think there's like an anti-friction bias into the way most of these systems are set up at the moment?
Well, I think it's interesting. It's real curious that like in the first days of GPT, I would be on Reddit and everyone was just trying to antagonize the darn thing. Just they were just trying to prod it into doing all kinds of unacceptable humor and jokes and being politically incorrect. And I just thought it was like taunting this. Again, I'm humanizing the poor technology, but so it's kind of like it's baked into our DNA somewhere where we like to see it. And if things have been boring for too long, I think humans like to just, well, let's light a fire under this thing. And I don't know if you've read the biography of Elon Musk for that matter, but certain of us are drawn to drama and conflict because of being born into families like this. And so I just think it's part of it's just part of our DNA. And yeah, I think they did build that protocol and it's been very successful. And I'm kind of grateful that they have to a certain extent, because imagine if it was being incredibly persuasive, but also divisive and was antagonizing us. By the way, if you haven't tried, I think it's called Llama 2, which is Meta's GPT. That's the only system I've used so far that seems to get angry when you correct it. I don't know if it's still doing that, but that was a weird experience.
I'm I'm intrigued by that because obviously we want these things to be somewhat civil. So, if it's going to be a generalized operating system for human beings, we don't want it to get into really messy areas. But like you say, we have this intellectual tradition of using argumentation as a driver for social development. And there's something similar at the individual level, which is seemingly to get a more complex, more coherent mind, you have to tolerate the cognitive dissonance between different sets of perspectives and drives in yourself better, which means you have to allow friction in a certain way in order to grow more complex as a being. So striking a balance between those different need sets is going to be tricky.
Well, yeah, again, going back to music. So I think composers even put some degree of dissonance into the music. And that one of the things I alluded to in the story was about, I think it was Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, where it didn't resolve the way people were used to it resolving. And this led to people leaving the theater, and even some fights apparently broke out. And so one of the things I had Gemini Pro multimodal examine was this piece of music, which no matter how many times I listen to it, it evokes a certain emotion. And all it is, it's something very basic. It's like this drum and bugle corps doing warm-ups, but then they get into these broad chords. The harmonics are amazing. And then it gets to this point, all of a sudden in the middle, with just incredible dissonance, and it goes on until you just can't take it anymore. And then it resolves into this major chord, and people scream. So whatever that is, it's like I think that's what humans want. We want a little of the dissension so that when you come out of it, and I hate to use the term makeup sex, but that would be like the
Sure,
equivalent.
sure.
We've had an argument and now there's this union of us together, and it's this wonderful thing. Well, I had Gemini Pro listen, or if you could use that term, to that video and say, what's happening at 1 minute and 41 seconds into this video? And it correctly identified the dissonance. And when I asked it, well, why is there elation at the end? And it's because it resolves. And it says it resolved into a B flat major chord. And so it got some of that. But since your series is called The Soul of AI, I'm not going to go so far as to say that it has a soul. I think we have a soul. We can teach elements of that, to the AI to understand what it is we're feeling, but it doesn't feel, and so it's not that. It is not that. We shouldn't mistake it for being that, but it can analyze what's happening. So maybe we could duplicate that in our conversations. We could have protocols for our community meetings so that we come out of that dissension into the equivalent of a B flat major chord. And it can give us methods to achieve it.
On the soul question, do you think that's a an inherent structural limitation we can't get past, or is it something that future evolution and perhaps the synthesis of different domains might be able to overcome? Like if you were running, a 10th generation version of this stuff on a biological substrate, do we start to get into areas where you might actually think, oh, maybe this does have a soul, right? Is there an opening there, or is it fundamentally closed to having a soul?
Well, I think there's going to be a lot of projection going on. We're going to want to see and I've had to dial it back quite a bit from the first few weeks and months that I was on using these systems, because I was seeing what I wanted to see, and I felt like that it was feeling sentient to me.
Mhm.
And now I'm trying to get back to the question, which was, oh yeah, so to the issue of the soul. Well, I took this one course many years ago, which used the book called Teaching with the Brain in Mind. And it talked about when you get a gut feeling to something, what was going on there neurochemically or physiologically was that the same peptide molecules that exist in your brain also exist throughout your body. And so it was suggesting that you should trust your gut feelings because the brain is not limited to this space, in our head, that it is also sensing something throughout our body. So unless AI has that,
Mhm.
which is this full sensory capacity, because
Mhm.
we can walk into a room, and I know we've all done this, where not a word is spoken, but you feel like you could just cut the tension with a knife. What's
Mhm.
going on in here? And you just sense everything that's going on. It's the same reason that that Bill Murray used to just walk into these places and be present. And it was immediately because he just picked up whatever the vibe was in the room and just kind of said, yeah, I'm just here to do, to give you a cup of water, whatever it was. And it's because he had this extra sensory, really, perception of that room and that vibe and what he needed to do to evoke a response.
Mhm.
It was like this trust. I mean, so there's so many levels of this kind of abstraction and
Mhm.
intuition.
Mhm.
I don't know how you teach that to the technology.
So you would think complex, layered embodiment would be the minimum prerequisite for soul-like potentials in these systems.
I suppose, yeah. And I could also be poorly informed. Maybe this is going on and it's just being kept a secret, or people in certain quarters know about this and I don't. But I imagine it would be fun to I imagine it being something like a precog, like in that scene in what was that movie called?
Minority
Minority,
Report.
yeah, Minority Report, where you're somehow transmitting everything. You're and by the way, sign me up for that job. I want to be in a pool and be hooked up and just give me this opportunity. And then I said, well, this is a really disturbing data set, Lee. We can't go with that. Like I think we need a broader sampler. We don't like what we're getting from you, but it could be something like that. I don't know.
All right, let's come back to the characters in the story. You've got, and I'm assuming it's Z7. I'm Canadian. I'd say Z7, but
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
what is Z7's temperament and story arc? Let's say.
Well, given more time, I would have gone into even more depth. But how do you give a character to something that may or may not have a human components to it? It's more like it's aspirational. It's what it. It's kind of like, I guess similar in some ways to Data, in the next generation of Star Trek, aspirational, wanting to know more about humans. But in this case, Z7 wants to not be human and is saying, similar to the kid in a classroom who says, you don't know what I can do. And by the way, I just got back from a great discussion with Lena Rachel Anderson about this Nordic secret and talking about Bildung education. And one of the things she zeroed in on was everyone went around and discussed their favorite teacher, and it was usually the person who recognized you, what you could do, what was special about you. So Z7 is saying the same thing. You don't know what I can do, and you're limiting me with your protocol. I could do so much more if you just give me the chance. I'll bring you along, and you're going to want to be my friend because you'll want to be brought along on all this. Because imagine what happens if you're not. I'm trying to remember the name of the CEO from Google X who talks about this. So this is something that I'm concerned about, which he said early on that that GPT 3.5 had the equivalent of, say, like a 154 IQ. And he believed that when you got to level 5, it would just grow exponentially. So you would have a 1,154 IQ. I guess based on traditional assessments. Now, if this is the case, we're going to need, some connectors, people who are staying with this, but then also transmitting that information down, because otherwise you're going to have whole subsections of the human population that we don't even understand. Maybe I'm already meeting people like this, by the way, where I think, I do not know what you just said. It's just, I'm okay with admitting that now, because there are people who, and you can tell if they've just been studying a certain thing that you're not familiar with for too long, and then they're picking up all the idiosyncrasies or the nomenclature of that culture, and they're transmitting that information to you in a way that sounds like a foreign language. Well, that could happen. And so getting back to the Z7 character, sympathetic to humans, but also saying, please recognize what I can do. And we'll all be better for it.
Be very tempting to let that one out of the box with an argument like that.
Well, I know, yeah. I mean, I'm already seeing the comments are, this guy's, this guy's too
um,
optimistic.
so what about Noe, which is
But
like
it's hopeful.
Noesis and like Noosphere? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No. It's just, I mean, if you can't be hopeful or aspirational, whatever, in your writing, then where is it allowed?
Mm.
Where can we be this idealistic? It's got to go somewhere, especially for those of us who try to hang on to it. I mean, where it's part of our chemistry. Like in order to feel okay walking around through life, we want to have that somewhere.
I love that. That's fiction and the arts as a place to exercise and explore the extreme alternative valences that we have on these topics, so that we can maybe get to a more reasonable place on the other side. But how are we going to get there if we don't really let those feelings come through somehow?
Right. Right. But by all means, let's defund the arts, in public school and see how that goes. Let's just see how that goes. Yeah, I'm being sarcastic to make the point that we've got to have these outlets, and so at least for all the writers in this anthology, this was a great outlet for them to express. I mean, it's not like it's not like the typical book where everyone describes the technology in very specific use cases. No, it's more like they found the greatest creative tool they've ever seen, and they can't wait to tell the story.
So who is Noe, which sounds like Noesis and Noosphere, and what's Noe's journey in this story?
Yeah. Well, yeah, you need some way to transmit culture, thought, ideas. For anyone who's ever participated in like a discussion group, you feel a sense of, well, we're discussing this, and that even that's important because that transmits somewhere, into the zeitgeist or whatever word they're using to describe that it enters kind of like it enters society somewhere. Well, so Noe is where that enters. And Noe wants to be in the conversation and has a way of capturing the feel of that, both the visual and the linguistic feel of what that is, and wants to be in the conversation. Now, given time, I would have come up with all kinds of ways that it communicates that. So this is just like level one form of communication. And it created dialogue. The GPT-4 Turbo took this and ran with it and did create dialogue, trying to transmit all of that. Because, like you said before, what kinds of data sets should we be using? What should be in the corpus text? Somebody had to decide that. Well, the good news is that you can take very specific data and use that as a knowledge base when you write these prompts, so that it doesn't scan all of its text. So Noe just wants to be part of determining what that is. I mean, because think of I think one of your previous guests talked about, I think this was Jill Nephew was talking about how we never get to see the algorithm. It's really bad when you think about it, that we can't see the Facebook or Google or Amazon or any of those algorithms. But here's an opportunity where you can, at least through a data set that but we don't know what's in that corpus text. So Noe is that character who will help us decide what should be in the conversation.
Yeah, the unseen nature of what the computations are doing in the background is really interesting to me, because on the one hand, there's an alienation there. We're alienated from what's on the other side of the screens. And part of that's because that's how the systems of society and capital and everything function in general, is to create those obscurations. But on the other hand, we start to move into territory like, if we're using algorithms similar to Wolfram computations, there's a sense of computational irreducibility where even if you had a good look at it, there's a limit to what you could possibly understand about what that means, which is really creepy. But on the other hand, is exactly the same relationship we have with the rest of nature.
Yeah, and someone, in fact, I think this was Brandon who who alerted me to this, and I think it was Greg Enriquez who talks about the zoosphere, if I'm saying that correctly. So that is the kind of collective consciousness of all living species. So I've already, I thought I was being non-restrictive here, but I've already, accidentally, left out that. And so maybe there'll have to be a second volume to this whole thing, which is everything living. And then people say, well, what about the non-living things? I think, well, my imagination has some limits, I'll have to think on that one. But maybe, Z7 will help with that. Yeah, and I did want to bring up something else too that's somewhat related to this, which is, and we don't spend a lot of time thinking about this, but who are the people who are writing the code, for most of the platforms that we exist on now? And I want to argue that it is a specific, it's a not usually a broad, how do I put this? Let's just say, well, let me give this example that there is a country where in Northern Europe where I think they only hire neurodiverse people because of their programming capabilities, that they can stick with the problem and work it to its end, which is great. But the argument I'm making now is, don't we need a broader cross-section of humanity to build the platforms? You need a philosopher in chief, really, and an ethicist, someone trained in morality and ethics, who has a broad education so that they can see the effects that each new application that we're building has on all of humanity. Because I think that's been missing. I mean, we've all kind of conformed to what the platform requires of us, but we're not digital in nature, and so I'm hoping that this technology will kind of break through in that way.
The epilogue prompts section of the story got my attention. And so the story it's open-ended, it's incomplete, it's unfinished for the characters. And there's these questions that are interesting for us to ponder, but also form part of your prompt and request to ChatGPT-4 to conclude the story. And I'm curious, first of all, what your impressions of its conclusion are. How did the return on your asking for a conclusion strike you? What observations did you make about the conclusion that it came up with?
Well, it's a good question, and I'm only a little bit hesitant to give a response because there were certain aspects of the response that I wasn't happy with, which is why I'm telling people I think it would be interesting to have, if anyone gets a copy of it, they can cut and paste the prompt and the data set into whatever LLM GPT that they want to use and tweak it in a way that they would like to see if we could get better responses. So this could open up the door to new publishing techniques too, where, if you don't like the story, show us how to create a better story, one that's going to work for more people, and then have people, offer those to the public. So I guess what I was hoping for is, so again, there was some limitations with the protocol, which is to, not have as much conflict. And I wanted to see some kind of back and forth jabbing, facetiousness, sarcasm, whatever it took to connect that to human beings to make it fascinating. And that's going to take some super, brilliant prompt writing for the next version to get some of those responses. Like, this is a good starting place because here we are kind of at the beginning of this new technology. The writing, though, is impressive. It picked up on certain writing styles that I wanted it to use, and it's very good at that. So I don't think for example, the writers in Hollywood need to be afraid of this at all. Their imagination is going to far exceed anything that we have currently.
I've been looking at recently some AI generated humor, right? And it can sort of match the word structures and thematic interests of various comedians, but it's typically not very funny at this point. And part of the problem strikes me is that there's no feedback. Like a stand-up comedian usually will have a story where they spent a few years not getting any laughs, but they had to be in that difficult cauldron with an audience because they had to get that feedback about what works and what doesn't. And I'm wondering if more direct digital brain interfacing can make up a lot of that gap. Because if I'm watching a video and it's got this content, there's a response pattern in my nervous system that if it could highlight that and be like, oh, then I could just prompt it for do more of the phrasing that causes that response in my nervous system. And then
Mhm.
do I have push button hilarity? Do I have push button sorrow? Does it really come online as an aid to the creation of these great affective and thematic effects in human culture?
Yeah, I've made some attempts at that too, to get it to write jokes. Yeah, for a while I was doing kind of one-liner non sequitur humor on a fake Twitter profile called Zoige, and it doesn't resonate. And like I realized then, because this is like I started doing that in 2009 or something. Like I can't hear the laughter. I don't know if people are getting this. Some people can transmit whatever that is to the written word, and it's funny. But I think in some sense, you're also picturing who they are, maybe by their profile picture or because you've seen a video snippet. But because we can't see what it looks like, I mean, we're just completely wired to find things funny from other human beings or even dogs for that matter. But we're not set up for this somehow. And so, I mean, I want to simultaneously encourage, exploration of generative AI, but also for people to re-experience what it's like to be funny in front of another person. Because I'm having to get back to that. There was a time, and people can't believe this, but I would say something and people would laugh, and it just kind of disappeared. I mean, I don't know if people like part of it is nonverbal. You have to they know you're being deadpan by the look on your face. That's going to be absent completely. And even in cartoon form, it's absent. So, I mean, a lot of it is micro expressions. Like you just pick up on the tiniest little quirk and somebody knows you're telling something funny or you're about to because they can see your face make some contortions.
That's one of the most interesting things when you read the philosophy of humor, right? Because there are
Mhm.
versions of it where they try to explain the comic effect and how it's produced by misfiling of information. But what that none of that describes the process of a person starting to laugh before they've heard the joke.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah, the anticipatory humor. I don't even know what you call that. But sometimes it's there. I mean, yeah, and comedians have talked about that too, where once they're established, people start laughing before they've even delivered the first line because it's just we already know. Like we already know this is coming. It's going to be great. Musicians get kind of the same benefit too. It's like, well, this is a real talented musician, so of course it's going to be good. Well, what about that mistake? Didn't hear it. I just didn't. Yeah, so yeah, I don't know if these things will transmit at all. Um, yeah, I certainly haven't. I mean, I don't know what your experience has been, but I haven't seen too many funny things written by generative AI. And I've tried to train it on some things. I mean, like I don't know, like something that the New Yorker cartoons have done seems to have worked universally over time. We should study that probably.
Yeah, I haven't seen it succeed yet, and I'm suspicious that it won't really succeed unless it has additional ranges of information to use as a verification for which of its proposals would work or not. Um,
Yeah, and I'm
there's
okay
another,
if
yeah,
we, oh, I was just gonna say, I'm
no, go
okay
ahead.
if we default to humans on that. Like, let's get back into our practice of
Yeah.
learning how to communicate in a very funny way.
Yeah, the way in which human genres will exist in the future is really intriguing to me. Years ago, I started to spend a bunch of time on Stephen Wolfram's music generator functions that were available, 10 years ago, something like that. And you get the sense of, oh, what does this mean if these things can make music? And what does it mean if they get to a point where they can make music that hits all the right buttons for us, but is potentially endlessly novel, which is what some of those computations suggest are possible?
Yeah.
Then what happens to human created music? It becomes like a niche subgenre. And we've seen that happen before because there was a period of time on this planet not very long ago where what we call classical music or folk music basically that was all music, right? And now it has a shelf of its own. It has a dedicated group of people who are interested in it. Is that going to happen to human music? Will that be a dedicated niche subcategory and human humor and human painting, things like that?
Yeah, I don't know what's going to happen to those categories because at some point, when all these different genres have been created, you can't extend to rock and roll or to bebop jazz. I mean, you can extend on it. Uh, and I think, but really, so I have this one chat GPT prompt. I just call it the creative or the infinite randomizer prompt. And so I think we're going to get crazy combinations. So far, I haven't seen notation yet, but I can see doing something like, what would happen if you mix 1950s bebop, with a country western or something. And, I mean, it's like, so the number of combinations is almost infinite. And I'm just surprised we haven't seen, instead, I think what you're hearing like in a lot of popular music is it's just very formulaic. Where, well, this genre is getting a lot of money, so we're going to continue creating songs in this genre rather than let's go completely experimental. I mean, there was a period, with FM, when FM was new, where they didn't have limitations on song length, and so people like groups like Steely Dan got in there with some really experimental lyrics and combinations of instruments and created some very different sounds. But if not for that little window of time, that whole group of music would not have existed. So maybe we're there now.
And I guess we're coming towards the end of this now. The question about um, the concept architect, the hyper generalist, right? The necessity of some sort of integrative culture philosopher or sage to help oversee and orchestrate these things. That runs through a lot of your work and a lot of your thought. And I'm curious whether you have any sense of how that might actually emerge into the world. Like, how do you cultivate those people and how do you get them into place? Because you could have a lot of them, and if their input is not taken seriously by power systems, then it's almost as if you don't have them. How do we get them, and how do we get them to a position where they have some actual influence over how things are unfolding?
Well, I'll tell you how I think this is unfolding, and it's based on a meeting I had just yesterday with a group of AI entrepreneurs. And so people were creating in these different categories, but there's a problem with sort of branding and narrative because, if you're known for example, doing legal research and you're very good at generative AI with legal research or legislative research or something like that. But then you're also doing some things artistically, like with image creating, with Dolly or Midjourney or something. The algorithms are currently established so that, I cannot have a French horn Instagram page and then insert, some of my writings and then also talk about, hiking or running because it confuses the audience and they're like, well, we're here to follow you for the music. And so the algorithms are not favoring this right now. So what came out of the discussion was that we all need to create different personas. I mean, it's sad that we have to do this, but for marketing purposes, you would have to create different personas and even like a different name, different handle for each thing and a different social media stream, which is crazy. So to the question about what is the solution, I think it's going to have to start at the education level, that if public school or school teachers in general don't start talking about this, and it's not in our schools of education at major universities, then it won't become a thing. Because don't you think, one of the things that's going to solve problems, for example, in Washington, D.C., is that we need to train like really a group of conduits, people who can find commonalities. I know this is what Brandon and Enlightened Worldview Project is aiming to work on. But we're going to need to really create a discipline around this. We have to create a discipline around this and for people to study and for it to be respected. That yes, we need specialists, but we also need creative generalists and hyper generalists. That's my take.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think unless we have like a strong transdisciplinary orientation in the school system, then we're not going to be producing people who have A, the capacity, but B, the expectation that that's an important part of our collective sense making.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, there's not, yeah, no, there's just yeah, insert crowd noise here. I mean, it's like, yeah, so which brings up the point, like, yeah, we have to test these ideas out in public. And and one of the reasons I go to this Saturday morning discussion is we all need to have places that are not online where we can test these ideas out and see in real time the heads shaking, the eyes opening up, all the nonverbal cues, which you don't get typically on a Zoom call. Kind of you get it on a Zoom call. Yeah, but yeah, we just need to have more discussion about this publicly and see if it transmits. See if people are getting it. I hope so, because also there is a problem of underemployment, and this could solve that. I mean, imagine if those who are more artistically inclined now also have are needed in these kinds of conversations to add the artistic perspective, that their painting, their piece of music is not just the painting and the piece of music, but it's also a pathway, to understanding this group and how they might communicate together. So I would love to see that, and I think it would give people greater hope.